Today I will talk about a recent research conducted by HEDAYAH that analyzed and presented the lessons from a decade of research and practice in the intersecting fields of preventing violent extremism and education, PVEE. And actually for the rest of this presentation, I'll use this acronym to refer to these intersecting fields. First, a bit of background information into our research. So HEDAYAH was pleased to conduct this research as the implementing partner for the recent GCTF, Global Counterterrorism Forum's education initiative, which aims to revisit, strengthen, and operationalize the Abu Dhabi Memorandum, which is the GCTF set of non-binding good practices on how education can be leveraged for PCVE purposes. And this initiative has three main outputs, now all available online. And today I'll talk about the first output, which is the research brief. As you can see from the slide, in our research, we sought to explore what new lessons, successes, challenges, or trends exist since the adoption of the Abu Dhabi Memorandum in the intersecting field of PVEE that different stakeholders need to be aware of. And to answer this question, we used qualitative data collection analysis, including a comprehensive literature review of 70 resources, a thematic expert workshop to gather the insights from experts, and further key informant and interviews to address the gaps from the first two steps before we developed our own inductive codebook and conducted data analysis and triangulation. And this is what we found. I'll first talk about the overarching research findings, which is a chapter of the research brief that outlined general themes, issues, and gaps identified from our research. And just a quick note that the findings presented here are based on our inductive codebook beyond the original framework of the Abu Dhabi Memorandum, and also the findings here are non-exhaustive, but we try to list those that emerged strongly from our research. So we found that in addition to sustaining continued and safe access to education, enhancing the quality of education is also key for building the resilience of students to violent extremism, including improving the substance and content of education. For example, we need to teach students certain subject matters and knowledge and improve how we teach them, including humanities and civic values and also media and information literacy, etc. We also need to develop some of their soft skills for resilience building, including cognitive and social interaction skills, and to develop their positive and open mindsets. We also found that it's important to prioritize learner well-being and emotions and to create safe and inclusive educational environments to avoid students from being switched off in class or feeling marginalized. Our research also sheds light on the importance of critical and transformational pedagogies, or how teachers teach, and also the need of capacity building for educators to build their knowledge and train them on how to teach and interact. We also found that communities can be really important spaces for PVV interventions, and we can engage many stakeholders there. Similarly, as the internet has become the primary source of informal education for many learners, we identify a strong need to respond to today's media and technology landscape in PVEE. Furthermore, we saw that translating PVEE policy into practice, or in another word, operationalization, needs to overcome many challenges. Some are systemic, some are more location-specific, and in order for PVEE interventions to be successful, at least efficient, it is important for them to be contextualized, localized, and for us to understand their outcomes and impacts, and also for us to introduce a more intersectional angle into these interventions. And in this page, I tried to regroup or recategorize some of our findings in the last two pages for our better understanding. So basically, the logic is, in PVEE interventions, even though our final beneficiary or target audience is always students and learners, our findings show that there are many actors actually we can engage and target in our interventions, and this speaks of the who question. For example, if you look at the first column, and if we try to focus on building the resilience of students and targeting them directly, we then need to ask the what and how question. For example, what should they learn and know? And this touches upon the issue of subject matter and knowledge. And then how do we want them to think and interact? And of course, have we care about how they feel in these interventions? And of course, as students and educators, they interact on a daily basis in traditional education institutions. We also need to ensure that all of the good messages and good knowledge in the first column are well received by students. So we need to think about how educators should teach and interact with students, or in other words, pedagogies. And we also need to take a step back to think about how to train educators on this knowledge and skills, because they do not necessarily have the knowledge, have the confidence, have the motivation to lead and teach these some challenging modules. Then, outside of schools, speaking of the who or where question, we need to engage with actors in the communities, including community leaders, family members, and we also need to meet students at where they are after class to help them navigate the complicated online landscape. Also, as I mentioned, in addition to only talking about PVE interventions from a more prescriptive angle, or what we should do, we also need to turn some of this theory into practice and think about contextualized design, how to overcome operationalization challenges, and also monitoring, evaluation, and learning. Another way for me to present our findings is to take a more didactic and theme-specific approach and link them directly with the Abu Dhabi Memorandum's 24 good practices, as this is partly the objective of the GCTF Education Initiative. But as many of us are not quite familiar with the memorandum, I'll just talk about this section very briefly. So what we did in one chapter of the research brief is to first show each good practice or issue area of the memorandum, and then we discuss our findings from literature review, interviews, and workshop in direct relation to each good practice and issue area before we highlight key takeaways and practical action points. And also at the end of this chapter, we introduce new and emerging issue areas and practices that did not emerge strongly from the memorandum. So I just wanted to show you guys one example. So in good practice 6 of the Abu Dhabi Memorandum, it emphasized the importance of critical thinking skills in helping students build their resilience to extremism and violent extremism. And in our discussion, we highlighted that critical thinking skill is still very important. And many scholars and also literatures mentioned that we need to develop students' healthy dose of skepticism towards information, etc. However, we also found that there are quite a lot of limitations and challenges behind only focusing on critical thinking skills. For example, it's difficult to be critical of certain things under certain contexts, and also critical thinking is not a silver bullet or a panacea for this issue. And noting that critical thinking is still important, and considering the complicated online landscape many learners are exposed to, we found that we need to take a step forward and make critical thinking skill go digital, and to develop students' media information literacy, and also noting that skills like critical thinking skills do not translate automatically into mindsets and dispositions. We also need to think beyond critical and develop students' cognitive complexities, flexibilities, or to develop their open mindsets to combat extremist mindsets, which is usually exemplified by their fixation with certain beliefs and ideologies and also methods. And as I mentioned, we also found a few emerging issue areas that did not strongly align with the framework of the Abu Dhabi Memorandum. I listed a few here, but I will only talk about maybe 1 or 2 of them. For example, although the memorandum called for engaging multimedia to advance educational approaches, it hasn't really touched upon the role of social media and emerging technologies in PVE. And we found that although there is lack of strong causal link between the proliferation of social media and students' radicalization, it does add a lot of complexities or complicate people's or students' unbiased access to information. And given that we need to navigate and balance the challenges and potentials of social media and emerging technologies like AI in education. And also, we found that the memorandum did not teach us on how to understand outcomes and impact in PVE and how success looks like in PVE. While we found that there is lack of longitudinal studies or comparatively weak monitoring and evaluation in this intersecting field, which may exacerbate some of the operationalization challenges like funding constraints. And of course, there are other issue areas like the need to engage adult learners and also how we consider neurodiversity in all of these interventions. Last but not least, I wanted to quickly go through some recommendations and practical action points emerging from our research. There are some cross-cutting principles like multi-stakeholder approach, or begin our intervention early in education and more actively engage youth and students in our intervention, and actually many of them echo with the original Abu Dhabi Memorandum. We also offered a few theme-specific recommendations after each individual good practice. I will not go into detail here because it's very similar to the example I showed you just now about critical thinking, and I would encourage you guys to read section 4 and 5.2 of the research brief. I just wanted to highlight some high-level recommendations related to the emerging issue areas identified. And we found that to respond to the complicated online landscape students are exposed to, we need to leverage the potential of new and emerging technologies in education to prevent and counter online radicalization. And also to turn PVE theory and policy into practice, we have to identify and address barriers that hinder the operationalization of PVE interventions. Similarly, we have to understand outcomes and impact in PVE and strengthen our monitoring, evaluation, and learning efforts. We may also want to consider the role of PVE in certain contexts, such as crisis, conflict, and emergency. And of course, we can continue to include more tools in our tool belt, such as embedding positive identity formation and proactive messaging within education. And as you all know, PVE is so interdisciplinary, and there are constant new developments in both the field of education and PCVE. There should be probably many more recommendations that can be listed here. So I will acknowledge that gap in the limitation in our research, and I will stop here by thanking all those experts and practitioners who participate in our research, my co-authors, Emma and Ferengis, and also the GCTF Education Initiative's co-leads, Morocco and EU, for their support. And I look forward to further discussions. Thank you so much.